Hey everybody, welcome to OKC Jug Users Group. I'm Brian Sheldon.
Yay!
So tonight we're having a meeting, having a presentation by Dave on unit session. Sounds cool. Our next meeting will be December 12th, and hopefully Eric Beach will stay awake tonight and will present J2ME. I'm really looking forward to. You can use a phone, you think?
Probably.
That just sounds.
I've already had some quirks with my phone. Like when I do a date two-string, it just prints out the address of the date instead of the two-string.
So two-string dot two-string.
I don't know.
It prints out the
One
address.
out of the two ain't bad.
Yeah. So anyway, I'm looking forward to that. Next steering committee meeting, we've moved to Monday nights because of Ryan. So it's going to be Monday the 27th at 6 o'clock. And I haven't checked with Francis Tuttle, but hopefully we'll be meeting there. Everyone's welcome. Anybody can show up. November 27th at 6 o'clock. Francis Tuttle's the winner at Rockwell, 142nd.
BFE.
You're all invited. Love your input. I'm still looking for people to help with the hello job stuff. If anybody has any ideas about what we can do for the first 30 minutes, feel free to let me know or someone on the street. And feel free to present something too. Tonight.
You might mention the incentive for presenting.
Not for the hello job.
No, for presenting. He said you might want to present something too.
Well, yeah, we always use presenters, but I mean the idea.
I don't know how long it goes.
Yeah, it's still the end of the year. Maybe we'll get one. But from now until this month and next month, we're going to get a presenter and one of you will get a copy of Idea 6.0, IntelliJ's IDE. Let's see. Oh, and we've got a request from Greg Freeman back there. He would like to capture presentations, put them out on YouTube or something. He would like another sort of video camera, digital preferably. You want to say something?
No, what my main goal is to get a screen capture and video of the person given the file. Not necessarily what I'm doing right now. I would like to inset, between the two, because you don't want to look at a cursor just standing there on the screen while the person's talking. You need a little bit more movement than that. That's why I need a second camera if I'm not able to do the screen capture part. So I can do one camera on the screen capture and the other would be on the presenter itself. I know that digital cameras only allow an hour a time, so I'm looking at a high 8 or around that area if possible, because I can at least take that tape and go back to my camera and edit it in. So, but digital 8 we'll just have to do, bring up more tapes and whatnot. But I'm not saying to keep the camera. You can bring the camera to the deal, and I'll just take the tapes from you at the end, and you can take the camera back. So.
Cool. Yeah, and if you have any expertise in video capture and getting it on YouTube, that's
I would like suggestions. Yeah.
suggestions. So in New Zealand, they drive on the other side of the road, like in Great Britain.
Yeah, it's weird.
Okay, well, I was going to say. Didn't really answer my question.
Did you rent from Hertz?
Is that what?
Did you rent from Hertz?
I didn't drive. We had.
So you're saying no?
No, I didn't.
Okay, so assuming in New Zealand they drive on the other side of the road than what we do, why did the Siamese twins move to New Zealand?
Get to the other side.
So the other one can drive?
So the other one could drive. Thank you very much. Hope I didn't offend any Siamese twins or
He
ex-Siamese
told
twins.
us the whole punchline.
Okay. So, a while back, I had my sister make this up. To thank Rod for being our president for however long you were our president. So she's got a little logo that says Oklahoma City Java User. So,
That's cool. Coffee cup. Nice.
They wouldn't let us use it.
I'm gonna wear that out on my next date with my wife.
Did you go to the search that?
So now we'll have
He's extremely
a word from our sponsor.
word from our sponsor.
A word from our sponsor.
Hey, Rod, a word from our sponsor.
Well, our sponsor.
Our sponsors over here cutting up. Anyway, yes, tonight Valtech has very graciously agreed to sponsor our meeting, so thank them for the pizza in the room. And most of you are already probably familiar with Valtech. I'm not going to say much about it, but Valtech we offer a wide array of services from traditional training to outsourcing, consulting, mentoring. So we do a lot of type of stuff. I have some brochures in the back and the ever popular stress balls and dice, as well as a couple of my business cards. If y'all want to give me a shout, we can talk about anything we've done tonight, or I can get in contact with people to answer whatever questions you might have. So again, thanks, Valtech.
All right, so if you didn't sign up on the sign-up sheet, Valtech would appreciate knowing how many people showed up tonight. You get a little blue ticket. You won't be able to win the idea at this point. And now, Dave Nicolette of Valtech.
Not going to save those till after. Just in case. Sorry. Let's see if I can remember what I was supposed to talk about.
New Zealand.
All right. Some of this is what Rod talked about, why you would have test cases at all. He was showing you test-driven development. Everybody doesn't do that, but everybody probably needs to test their code. And the stuff that I'm talking about is methodology agnostic. It's just about how to isolate your tests. Whether you're writing the test first or not, you still want your tests to be isolated so that they won't be fragile, they won't break because of things other than the code you're trying to test. Basically the idea. And I just said, so slideshows. But you don't want to see side effects of something else. So let's go through these. So what do you isolate? Somebody asked what a unit test was, integration test. Was that you, Brian? Well, there's a lot of ambiguous terminology about testing. Unit is whatever you need it to be. It just means whatever chunk of code you're trying to test. Some people like to try to unit test individual methods, and they call that a unit test. Others, more typically, a whole class. You have a unit test class that corresponds to some application class. Or you could say that multiple classes are your unit. And that's where the ambiguity starts coming in, because that's what some people would call an integration test, where you're testing multiple classes and how they collaborate. All of this stuff, most of the stuff about isolating tests, has to do with the kind of testing that developers do while they're building an application. QA testers have a different view of all this. They don't usually isolate things as much because they test at a larger scope. They would probably think an integration test meant they were testing the way your whole application integrates with a technical environment with other applications in it. But developers often just think of an integration test as a bigger unit, more than one class. Anyone else have any terminology, thoughts, or any terms that you'd like to use about your test? Pretty much on board with those words and everything?
Might like your person. I might like to know how you figure the word functional test plays into that.
Well, the way I think of a functional test is you're thinking of one function of an application. Like you're going to click on some button, and this is going to result in adding Ryan to the Jug roster. So maybe you've got some kind of a web app for that, and it's got several layers in it, and it goes out to a database and comes back. One functional test would be just to test that, all that behavior from the time the user clicks on that until they get a response back. So it's kind of a vertical slice through the application to do one thing. That's the way I think of a functional test. Now, the way you might isolate a functional test, you may want it not to go to the database. You may want to control the data that the test sees. So you may choose to isolate it at that level. In fact, some of these slides sort of depict these ideas. So we'll go through here. This one is the typical unit test that most people will think of. They're going to isolate just one class and test the behavior of that class. And so you want to block off anything else that class calls, anything else it's dependent on. You wouldn't want that external resource over there on the upper right to break your test, because you're not testing the external resource. You just want to test that class. And and so on. Same for that class, blocking everything else. Now here's what a programmer would typically think of as an integration test. These two classes collaborate to perform some of their functionality. Now you're satisfied that they each work in isolation. You want to make sure that this little chunk of functionality here that involves both of them works. And now here's one this would be sort of a functional test. It's going to pass through some of the application code, hit an external resource, get something back, and so on. So the scope of these tests gets bigger and bigger. I would think, and any of you have a different view of this, speak up, but I would think that normally you're going to want to test at the smallest scope first. If all those tests pass, you're going to test at a larger scope, and then maybe at another larger scope than that, and that's probably enough. Then you're probably running a whole application. Would you concur that that's typical? That normally the way you test your code? There is another point of view about that out there. Some people think you should test at the largest scope only. They don't believe they need to test. Any opinions about that point of view?
They're crazy.
Crazy? Any others?
They're lazy.
Here.
Why bother? Why bother? Okay. Yeah, that's about my view.
It becomes a lot harder the bigger your application gets to test. If you just want to test the public-facing side of it, I mean, if it's a million lines of code and you just want to test that.
Yeah. And if you get a failure, where do you even start looking?
Right. Yeah. You're going to
So
test that
once you get to this
before
level here and you want to test the whole system, you want to be pretty confident in all the little pieces so that you can be sure if it fails at this level, it's got something to do with the way these things hook together. And it's not some silly little bug in the middle of the class somewhere. And there's all kinds of external resources you have. And a lot of people don't bother blocking these things out. They have unit tests, but they actually read files. They actually read a database. And they think it's sufficient to have a test database or a test file. Well, that certainly is better than hitting live data. But it's not as good as having completely controlled test data. Reasons are to make the test suite useful in the way that Rod's presentation showed. The tests have to be automated and they have to be repeatable. So if you're ever going out to a real database server, you don't have a repeatable test. I see heads nodding up and down. Everyone understand why that's not repeatable? What could break that's not part of your test? The database could be in a different state than you expect. Or it could be down. Or the network could have a problem. You might not be able to get to the database server. And those are not the things you're testing at that time. You're only interested in the way the class behaves when it gets certain data from the database. What's your comment?
What if your database is in memory and starts out empty?
That is the way it should be. He just said in a quiet voice, what if your database is in memory and it starts out empty? Yeah, that's right. That's a way that you can isolate your test case from a real database. And I got an example of that to show you.
But in practice, if you do that, I mean, I understand removing integration tests. Those in-memory databases like Hypersonic don't behave the same as your database. And what you think is working if you hit against Hypersonic may very likely fail, especially when you start dealing with foreign key constraints or just constraints in general.
It's possible.
It's likely, actually.
Yeah.
Like Hypersonic and MySQL, I mean, Matt has come across that combination, or Hypersonic and DB2.
Yeah, ideally, if you can test that way, it's best. But we all have to be pragmatic, too. It's not going to do you any good to test something that you know is not behaving the way the real thing's going to behave. So sometimes you do. You just have to have your own test database, probably on your local machine, and you can set it up that way. That'd be the second best thing. So I think in-memory is the best thing. Local is the second best thing.
I might qualify that with only your tests that are, only when your code test deals with persistence in some way, would that matter? If your code or test does not deal with persistence, then who cares if it's a different database anyway? You'd want to have isolation from the database platform.
I'm thinking if you're using something, and if we're going way off, you said you had a little extra time, right? So if I'm going off topic, just tell me to shut up.
Well, I knew you were here.
Like, if you look at the JPA, Java Persistence API, depending on how your cascading set up, something that you might do an add to a set might end up in a result of a transient object or something like that. So, you know, that kind of behavior probably won't be dependent upon the database. That'll be dependent upon the JPA. So maybe there's not much of a difference there, I guess.
Yeah, in many cases, I think you can present your code under test with the result that you want it to have.
Yeah.
Now, how you get that result out of hypersonic versus SQL Server or DB2, that's a different issue. But there are cases when maybe you can't really achieve that level of isolation. What if you're testing stored procedures or something?
Yeah.
A JDBC driver.
Yeah. Well, yeah, now you're actually saying that you're testing the JDBC driver. So you wouldn't isolate that. If you were testing the behavior of a class that makes a JDBC call, then you're not testing the JDBC driver then. You're just testing the class. And there's all kinds of other things, and I don't know if I ended that in slides, but here's one where you're testing something, it's a servlet, it talks with EJB. You're not testing the EJB, so you want to fake that out. Another direction to look at it, layers of your application. If you're testing something at a certain layer, you don't want that test to be interfered with by code and other layers. It really all boils down to the same kind of techniques. It's just different reasons why you might want to abstract things. Your application design maybe is based on design patterns, most of which involve multiple classes that collaborate. Maybe you want to just pick out one of those and unit test that one class. So you don't want any extraneous failures from the collaborating classes. There's a lot of ways to do this. Mostly it turns out to be pretty simple to do with your own code. Test fixtures are just a reliable, repeatable test data that you know that the test is always going to get the same data as input or output for your certain. Stubs, mocks are just types of fake classes that you can write. The stub is one whose methods all return some lowest common denominator value. If they return a reference to a class or reference to an object, they'd return a null. If they return some kind of primitive, they return as close to a nothing as works for that primitive, like a false for a Boolean, 0 for an int. That's what stub does. Mock has a little bit more smarts. It knows when its methods have been called. Maybe it can count how many times they've been called. It can respond with some predefined result from a method call, that kind of thing. Simulator is just a class that mimics the behavior of something. It's not the real something, but it's close enough to fool the code that you're testing. I'd say an example of that is that in-memory database that Brett mentioned.
Actually, but that's okay.
Huh?
I think Matt should be good because he said it in the quiet voice.
Who did?
Matt did. Matt remember data voice.
He said that?
Yeah, it was a quiet voice. It wasn't my voice.
Oh, I'm sorry about that, Matt. My hearing's not that good. I sit near Ryan, so my ears are ringing all the time. Aspect, you've heard of aspect programming. Another way you could fake out the class is by dynamically changing some of its methods. It really has the same effect as some of the other techniques, only it's a lot less obvious to most people. The only one really smiling is Brett.
I'm laughing at it. I'm not laughing with it.
Oh, okay. Yeah, well, it is possible to do that, and unfortunately, when something is possible, somebody actually does it. Some other things you can do to do yourself a favor is design for testability. I'm not suggesting you should make that your primary design consideration, but generally speaking, well-designed code is easier to test than sloppy code. It just lends itself better.
Could you elaborate a little bit on the differences between the mocks and the simulators?
I would think of a simulator as something that really mimics the behavior of some other resource that you're working with. A couple of examples I've got here, like an SMTP server that you could run in JUnit. So if your class is supposed to send and receive mail messages, you don't actually have to have a mail server going to test that.
So the simulators are just for external resources that you're replacing?
Well, typically, I haven't seen much need to write anything elaborate for just another class, because you know what you're running the risk of there is making your fake class so complex that it warrants its own test suite. And you're just in kind of further argument with yourself or something.
Matt, an example we have is the mock security on the ASAP project. This really is a simulator because it does everything the back-end security does. And you run the same test against both the real security and the fake security that behave the same way. And that's because
So we should call that a simulator?
well, that's by Dave's definition as a simulator. And
Yeah,
it was
the words
necessary.
are ambiguous.
Yeah, and by
If you like a different word, that's fine. When you're working with code, I forgot who said it, but someone was saying it would be good if Rod could have shown how hard it is to write a unit test for pre-existing code. Well, sometimes the code doesn't lend itself to testing. You're assigned to do something, you pick up the code, you see that it doesn't really have a good set of unit tests already. Maybe you decide to remediate that as part of your work. You're going to add some unit tests to it, make it a little better. Or maybe even the test that you want to write for the work you want to do is not present. You need to add that. And it turns out that the class you're trying to test is written in such a way that it's difficult to narrow down the piece of code that you're interested in testing. It's okay to refactor the code a bit to make it more amenable to testing. There's no rule that says you can't do that. So you may actually modify parts of the application that you wouldn't, strictly speaking, have to modify to make the change you're trying to make. You're just making that modification to help yourself test it. It's okay as long as you don't break anything important. Maybe the code is structured a certain way for certain reasons. You make sure you understand what that is before you mess with it. But generally speaking, it's supposed to be safe to refactor because refactoring by definition doesn't change the behavior of the application, it only changes structure. So only kind of case where that might be an issue is if something is designed a particular way because of a performance requirement that's unusual, and maybe if you restructured that, you would break that requirement. You wouldn't meet the SLA for it or whatever it is. So then you wouldn't be able to refactor that. But in most cases, you can refactor a little bit to make testing easier. Yeah.
Even then, I'm not going to take a lot of time. Performance can be tested too.
Well, yes, performance can be tested, but my point was that you don't just refactor helter skelter without understanding why the code was structured in the way it was to begin with. And if it was structured that way for performance reason, you don't want to break that. You just have a bigger challenge for testing, so you just have to live with that. Handy tools, well, we've been over some of this stuff. Testing frameworks, you saw one of those already. JUnit is one. Another one that's popular for Java is called TestNG. And as far as I know, those are really the only really widely used ones. Does anyone know of others that are very popular at all?
JBehave, sort of.
JBehave, yeah. Any others? No? Yeah, I didn't think there were too many others. Oh, there's another tool we might use once in a while.
Blasphemy! You can't license one of those things.
You can't license it?
Yeah, you can't license, so Birch won't let you use it.
Microsoft has.
Oh, that's right.
They figured out a way.
It's not approved.
It's not approved.
Not an approved tool. Well, just keep it quiet when you use that. Now, this picture is just like the other one with the blobs on it, and it sort of shows where you might stick some of these fake classes and simulators and things like that. Your test case is going to set all that up. That's why the lines are there. And then your code under test is going to interact with those fake things, and it's going to think they're real. But the only thing that supposedly can fail is the code that you're really testing. These other things can't fail in a way that mess your test up. And there's another one, integration test. So now you're really running 3 of the classes. Everything else that's involved is blocked out. And another example of the same thing. So I could use Ryan and Brett to throw in a lot more comments because there's not a lot to say about these repetitive slides. Okay, typical test case, as you saw earlier, you're going to set up your preconditions for the test, make sure everything is the way the world looks the way you want it to look to test the case. Then you're going to run the code. Then you're going to assert what you expect the world to look like after the test runs. And assert is, as you saw before, that's the real buzzword to use, the real method. Any questions so far? Comments? I'm not getting as much heckling as I need to fill up all this time.
I don't know if you've got it planned later, but what are some of the trade-offs about putting more test logic into your mocks and stubs and simulators and less in your test case? Put it in particular your expectations.
See if I understand your question. You mean because some mocking libraries will actually throw the assertion failure themselves instead of referring that to the assertion framework?
Right, there are some trade-offs for spreading out the logic that is part of your unit test among many different files and separating it from the logic as part of whatever tool you're using to isolate your test.
Okay, now I'm getting more confused about your question.
Well, because you can manually write a mock class yourself and put assertions in if you want. I mean, you don't need a library to do that. But now you've got some of your unit test logic in your unit test, some of it in this mock class over here. So there are some trade-offs to that. To me, most of it is readability.
Yeah, I can see readability, but you are creating these mocks in this part of your test case where you establish preconditions. So it is all part of your test case. It's not often somewhere far away where you're not going to see it. But I do agree with you. I kind of prefer all the assertions to be handled by the assertion framework. I don't particularly like mocking libraries taking that away and doing it. But just for readability. And they don't all do that. JMockit doesn't do that. They take the idea that this is a mocking facility, it's not an assertion framework. So I'll do all the mock stuff for you, and do your assertion. But some of them take a different philosophy and build it all in.
Hey, Dave, I have a question.
Yeah.
So on the established preconditions, could you distinguish that from, say, I'm going to be very concrete, the setup method on JUnit, or is that the setup method on JUnit? I don't think you mean that in that box.
Part of establishing your preconditions could be in the setup method, because that's going to run prior to every test case. But every test case is unique also. So you may have code in each of your test cases that does some setup. Some of them may be pretty simple. You know, some of the ones that Rob wrote were just an assertion. They didn't really need any setup. Others, you may need some fairly elaborate setup that is not in your setup method because it's not common to other tests. So the combination of all those things amounts to establishing your precondition.
There's a concise way I've seen this described by the behavior-driven development folks. They basically just take the same thing that test-driven development does, which would be these three boxes. And instead of using these words, they call the top one your givens, the middle one your events, and the last one your outcomes. So you're saying, given this context, these things happen, and I expect these outcomes to occur. So your preconditions may be setups for all your tests, or they may just be this one test needs this context.
Yeah, I understand that. I still think it misses something, because I think the setup and the teardown, if you will, are I mean, maybe I've been using JUnit for so long that I always think of the 5 steps, right? There's setup, unique to the particular test case setup, test execution of the code, assertions afterwards, and then cleanup afterwards. Return back to an initial state. So get to an initial state, establish preconditions, exercise, assert postconditions, return back to initial state somehow.
I would say that is sort of a tool-oriented.
It is a tool. I understand that.
Because the teardown is just making sure the world is fresh again for the next test. It isn't really part of the current test, except that that's the logical time to do it. So, yeah. But, I see what you mean. And with JUnit 4, then you've also got before and after the whole test class. So you can do some setup for the whole class all at once. It only happens once. Then you can also do a setup for each method and a teardown for each method.
Sounds like an isolation risk to have setup for your whole file.
An example?
And there are times when you need, the whole list of test cases in this one class is testing some set of behavior that logically belongs together, and you can set up some of the preconditions all at once.
An example I use because one of the things I like in my unit tests is they should have no output at all. The only output should be a success or failure based on the bar you're using JUnit. And so in the before class, I set up a logger configuration so that it only reports errors. Because otherwise, if you use the default logger configuration, typically you get a whole slew of useless output that serves no purpose with respect to my test.
That's a good point, and we'll get to that some more too. Just some more elementary stuff here. Why do we care about all this stuff? Why not just go read a file? Why not just go to a database? Because, as Rob's demo kind of indicated, what we're doing is building up an automated test suite that we can run again and again. And they're all repeatable, they're all reliable, so you know they're going to be data synced. And as Brett pointed out, we want them to run fast, because not every methodology is the same, and then this isn't supposed to be about methodology, but let's say you were doing some kind of an agile methodology for development. You're typically going to write 2 or 3 test cases, make them pass, refactor, do that a couple more times, then you're going to synchronize and check in. So it's like every 30 minutes, every 20 or 30 minutes all day long, you're checking in, and you're running the test suite every time. So it's got to be fast, or else it will discourage you from doing that, and you'll end up writing a large amount of code before you check in. And where that leads you is a lot of conflicts when you're synchronizing with the repository, and you spend more time resolving conflicts and less time writing code. So that's the idea behind that, and that's why speed is always mentioned as a good thing for these test suites.
I might just add that even if you're only going to run them once a week or whatever frequency you're going to run them, you want the time it takes them to run to be negligible compared to the frequency you run them. So if you run them every 2 weeks, 4 hours is probably fine. If you run them every 10 minutes, you probably want to keep it under 30 seconds because you're waiting for them to run while they're running.
Well, that's a good general point. I would think 4 hours. We're no longer talking about developer type testing. Now you're talking about maybe performance testing or stress testing or something that takes time.
Or BIST, built-in self-test. It's like a term I remember a few years ago. I was like this.
Okay. Now we'll get to something that Brett started to mention. You don't want to have a lot of output to look at. You don't want to have to visually look at anything, right? You want your assertion framework to be able to say this is true, this is false, whatever. So you don't want to have any dependencies even on system out or system error. And it's pretty easy to block those out. And let me see if I can not respond.
You have a mouse.
Yeah, I don't have a mouse. So Brett or Ryan could talk for a couple minutes.
Okay, I got one for you. I came across something that's sort of like a bug in JU4 yesterday, but it's not really a bug. I had before. Let me explain. I had a before method in both a abstract-based class and then another abstract-based class and then a concrete test class.
Okay.
And those abstract-based classes are very small and do one very small thing, so I think it makes sense to have them. And I happen to name the method the same in both the base class and the derived class. And in JUnit4, it automatically calls all the ones up the hierarchy in a logical sense with the annotation. But if they happen to have the same name, then the one with the same name in the derived class hides the one in the base class.
Didn't you override it then?
Even if you override it, it doesn't matter. I wanted both of them to run, and only one of them ran because it was hidden. So it's something with JUnit4. If you have your before methods or your before class methods or your after methods or your after class methods named the same throughout the hierarchy, woe be it to you because your initialization will be missed.
It's called super.
Huh? Well, yeah, but the whole point is that the JUnit4 hierarchy calls them for you. You don't call them. It automatically calls them, and it also guarantees in a well-defined what the order is. It defines the order.
Okay, if that happened then, what if you declared an abstract method in your base class and labeled it before? Then you overrode it.
It wouldn't work because JUnit would say, hey, this is an abstract method, I'm guessing. Or maybe it wouldn't be a problem. So don't name your before and after the same name. Which makes sense, right? Because the names of the methods should be what they're initializing. There you go. There's your.
Thanks, Brandon. The timing was perfect. Well, this is what I came up with to redefine the system out, system error, and system in. Just some helper methods. Something that you'll do when you're writing unit tests maybe is write some helper classes for yourself that you're going to reuse. And some of you probably are smarter and can do this easier. But anyway, the point is that Java gives you a way to substitute your own I/O stream class for any of those standard I/O stream classes. The advantage of that is that now the test cases can grab the output that the code under test is writing to those streams and do assertions on it. So at this point, you don't have to eyeball the console to see if the output is what you want it to be. You can let your test case see if the output is what you want. So it helps with automating the test. I know a lot of people don't bother to take it to this extent. So I would welcome heckling at this point.
I might have refactored the output stream and input stream that the class under test was taking to something that I provide to the class under test instead of allowing it to call system doc out and system doc.
Well, that may be a good idea, but there's an awful lot of code out in the world that does that. Yeah.
Specifically, let's say you are writing the integration test and you don't have access to the API to control what it's sending the system out, but you do just want to check something, and then that's how you do it.
I'm sorry, if you're writing integration tests, you want to do what?
And you're making some call to some third-party API that you don't have direct access to, but you want to see what it's spitting out.
See, that's where you throw in aspects.
Well, I know.
Yeah, this would work for that too. Aspects would work for it too, probably.
But try not to do that if you can help it.
You know, it's amazing how nice it is not to have all that output, though, because then output is unexpected and wrong.
Yeah, but you could use this to assert that that never happens, right?
Yeah. And then the test suite can fail because someone produced
Something
that
or
error.
system out.
I like it.
Don't hammer nails with a screwdriver.
That's good, that's wise. Don't hammer nails with a screwdriver.
You could use the other end to try to work it. I've done it
That's-
before.
Yeah, I have too. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, you just take the screwdriver, point of the screwdriver like that, and hold it firmly in your palm.
Yeah.
You can hold it like this. You don't have to.
Oh, okay. Well, anyway, I don't know if this is like
You take a screwdriver and break into a hardware
You need
store
a
and
slide
steal a
on a
hammer.
screwdriver.
I do have one, but not in this presentation. It actually shows two kinds of screwdrivers. And the point is to use the right tool for the job. Very clever, actually, but you'll have to take our word for it. So here's a test class that uses these helpers, and the way I wrote it was you could just say record system out, and then run your code under test, and then later you can say replay system out and make assertions on it. So that's one way. You can probably think of a dozen other ways. But the goal is that you're not spilling out a bunch of junk onto the console that somebody has to look at. You're making the data available for assertions, so it can be automated. Any thoughts about that?
I like it.
Somebody liked it.
I like your Java format.
Wouldn't it be easier to just assert on the data instead of having to read through the output stream?
If you can do that, yeah.
Well, I mean, isn't the class that you're testing is going to modify some data, either that you pass into it or that it generates and then passes back out?
Well, it may not return the data from the method. Just write sys out or sys error in the middle of a method somewhere.
No, Dave, this is an example of really sort of a black box approach to testing something.
Yes.
Really, I mean, you can't change it for whatever reason. If you can change it, change it. That goes back to change it for testability.
Yeah.
If you're making some command line Unix tool, sometimes it's supposed to operate with the system in and out in certain ways anyway. So that could be the desired behavior.
Could be that. Or it could just be a message that it spits out. Or something, some reason.
So that's a global variable in shared memory.
You may want to test that it writes something to the log. And so you configure your log so that the output to the log is system out. Then you can just grab it and look at it. It may just be an expedient like that. Could be a variety of reasons that might be handy. But like you say, if you've got a better way to test whatever your immediate need is, then go for it. So, we don't want to look at this one anymore. What was the next one? We're still blocking out streams, right? So,
Properties.
how about file isolation? So that you don't have a dependency. This is just even a local file on your workstation. Even that may be fragile. You you may not be able to count on that always containing what you think it contains. Maybe your configuration got messed up and you don't have writes to it or something. So when you try to write your test data to it, it doesn't actually happen, and then when you try to assert that it was in there, it's not. So you can fake this out too, because it's just another I/O stream. Java gives you this I/O library. It's very flexible for just replacing streams with anything you need it to be. So this one just pretends that there's a file there. You can see it all. So what am I testing here? I forgot what this was doing. Okay, so it's got, he wants to make, this is a trivial class that takes some string, wraps it in XML, writes it to a file. So we just want to make sure that happens. So instead of using a real file, we just fake it out and do it in memory. Does that make sense? Sound useful? Okay, so there's a way you can fake out files. And you can also fake out, what if you can't do that? For some reason, whatever reason it is, you don't have that much flexibility. Well, I think, like I said before about the databases, I think the best choice is in memory, second best choice is local. Same kind of thing with files. So you don't have the option in this, for some reason, to fake out the file completely, and at least make it a temporary file. So Java has this temp file thing. It'll create a file for you on the fly. It's a little bit less susceptible to junk that happens on your system that might mess up a file that you think should be there, because it just creates it on the fly and it gets rid of it. Yeah.
I paired with Dave once and watched him do this in order to make a Spring config be there that had just what we wanted and nothing more in it, because the class under test needed to have Spring. And I just want to say that this was this accomplished what you're talking about. It simply isolated the behavior and only the behavior we wanted to test.
Yeah, we weren't testing Spring. So, in fact, I think, personal opinion here, for unit tests particularly, you shouldn't ever really have to have a dependency on any kind of container. You ought to be able to test any single class in isolation without a container.
Yeah, in fact, I think we ended up refactoring so that we didn't have to use Spring in that class.
Yeah.
I think Spring recommends that when you're running tests that you don't use Spring to inject stuff manually, isn't that?
Yeah, I think that's correct, yeah, because your test case can inject just like Spring does.
I do. They have that recommendation in one part of the documentation, but then they have like some abstract-based classes. They self-inject themselves, right?
Yeah, so you didn't want to listen to our advice, so here you go. Here's something to help you.
It's the kitchen sink.
Yeah. The kitchen sink is a very handy thing to have.
I think something worth pointing out.
Not clean enough to eat out of.
This might seem like a little bit of a hassle. It might. I don't know if it does or doesn't. But if you spend a little bit of time every day doing this, 6 months from now, a year from now, right now at ASAP, we spend anywhere from, 20 minutes to 40 minutes to run the common tests. And if we just stopped doing, started doing these kind of things about a year and a half ago, those unit tests would probably be down to well under 5 minutes, probably under 3 minutes. And it would have made a huge difference.
And when one would fail, you'd know why it failed.
Right. We don't have, a lot of our tests are not isolated. And so, oh wait, someone decided to reset the qual database and didn't tell us about it because, they just didn't tell us about it. All of a sudden we've got 20 tests failing, continuous integration is failing, and people are scrambling to fix it. If those tests had been isolated, that wouldn't ever happen. So this is very valuable. It may seem like you're taking a lot of time, but if you've got 20 people on a project, multiply by 20 the amount of time you're saving. And you're going to realize that this kind of investment, it pays for itself easily in days' time, if not weeks' time.
Why didn't Valtech tell us about this 2 years ago?
Brian,
I just started at Valtech recently.
Brian, how long have we been trying to tell you about rewriting the tests? And how long has it been one of those pile of things on the pile of turd that just isn't important enough because we've got functionality to work on?
But now we have the word turd on the video.
And pile of turd.
We'll start over.
You're going to edit this, right?
We'll get rid of it folks. Already.
I created mocks
I
down
think YouTube will let us
and
do
queue down, right?
Uh-huh.
And
So what I did to test my component was I had a getter and setter for that Dow, and in my test I called the setter on it and set it to the mock Dow new instance. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's a perfect example. That's great. Yeah.
Instead of mentioning the spring.
We've done that several times.
Is there an advantage to doing faking that spring to what?
What you did is better.
Yeah.
Yeah. What you're doing is you're eliminating the dependency on the back end, whatever that may be. Making sure your test class has, your code under test receives a response as if all the conditions were right for that test in the back end. So, yeah, that's great. Probably saved you some time, too.
That was really easy to do. I was surprised.
Yeah. I don't know how many people in your work at Hertz, because people are mentioning specific things there, and I don't know if everyone relates to that. But basically what he's talking about is this thing, I think it does an MQ series. One of those pseudo-synchronous kind of MQ series things out to another system. It gets a response back. All right, so all he's doing is cutting out that part that goes to the other system. And he's presenting his test case with a response as if it had come back from the other system. So it's isolated there. Yeah.
Do you have a recommended way to mock out JMS?
I have a JMS example here, actually. Yeah. Hooray. It's not a screwdriver, but it's a big hammer.
Is it Java docs as well as this last one? Because I was just, really, your Java docs, beautiful.
I decided to go with the Latin alphabet for the Java docs. I think that helps a lot. I don't know how you would have Java docs beautiful.
Well, they're there and everything in them has information.
Oh, directory.
You don't just have a hat return with nothing to have it for a hat for with the name for it.
An app param with a whole parameter from like 3 rows.
Well, there's one more file kind of isolation thing. This just pretends to be a directory. So we don't really have to read through all of it. In fact, you can download all this stuff if you want to look at it later. So maybe it'll give you some ideas. Okay, now. I'll say properties, yeah. That's the one I was talking about.
Hey, what about JMS?
JMS, who's that? Well, you can, properties are usually just files too. So you can just plug in any properties object that you create and make your code under test use that instead of its properties file.
What might be an advantage of using a properties object instead of a mocked out, a fake properties file, a temp file, right?
It just seems more natural to me since you're talking about properties, because that's ultimately what your code's going to look at anyway. I mean, it doesn't care if it's a file or not. Maybe the only difference would be if the code you're testing actually does that. Is it called the load method?
Oh, yeah.
Well, it reads the file in. You may need to fake it out that way. Yeah. But then it's just another file. And you use that other technique to do that. Okay. And database. Let's see.
Can you go back?
Yeah. What would you
On
like?
that last class sheet.
Yeah.
I was just concerned that if something were to break in the middle of that, would you be resetting your properties back? I'm just wondering if you would hurt tests that run later.
Well,
Yes.
it's got this after method.
Okay.
So the JUnit framework is going to run that. I mean, unless the whole thing just blows out of the water, it's going to run
I
that.
But
haven't
if that happens, then you're already in your test anymore. So
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
you're isolated there.
I haven't really dealt with annotations, and I think that's part of it.
Well, yeah, these examples use JUnit 4 and Java 1.5.
So before is set up and after is there.
Yeah,
Except you can have multiple of them.
yeah, you can have multiple of them.
And
And
there's
you've
a few
got this kind of
differences.
thing. I don't think this one has it. Yeah, there's like a before class, I think it's called.
Right.
Class.
At before class and after class.
Yeah.
Is the ordering predictable if you have multiple before and afters?
No.
It's predictably random.
It's
Now,
not supposed to.
within a class, it's predictably random, but within the hierarchy, afters always go top down and befores go bottom up. Just like think of it just like construction and destruction from C++. Same ordering.
Wouldn't it be easier to have one before that calls stuff in order rather than have a random set of these initializer methods?
If
Well,
it's
you
important to you to have those things run in order, yeah.
Right.
You typically don't have multiple befores and afters. It's just there's nothing stopping you from doing it.
Yeah, I think that would be kind of hard to read and understand maybe if you had too many. So yeah, your point is well taken. But is that okay?
I get it now.
Okay. And you can look at this at your leisure too. I guess it wouldn't be leisure.
Hey, is this already up on the OKC Jug wiki?
I don't think so. I'll have to give it to him. It's on my website, but I have to give it to this one too. Probably
Is that nicolester.com?
Huh?
Is that nicolester.com?
It isn't, but you're welcome to type that in all night.
Grab that domain if I can.
You should be able to create a
Yeah. Well, here's a